having us as well. So we're here from the University of Glasgow, specifically from the anatomy facility, from the School of Medicine, Dentistry and Nursing. And we would like to present a very practical example of how we use generative AI, and specifically an open platform, which is ChatGPT, for a quick transition from short answer questions, transforming them into MCQs. So this is very much a practical example, and it builds very nicely to what Peter and Sue were explaining at the start of this session. So this is work between myself, Dr. Caroline Allen, and Dr. Michelle Welsh. So what am I going to cover in this talk? So first of all, just a little bit of an overview of what is generative AI, although Peter and Sue did a brilliant job earlier on. A little bit about prompt engineering, because I'm going to have a live demo of how we can use this platform. And I'm quite keen on how we can get the best prompts out. As Sue was saying, what we put in is what we get out. Michelle will cover the rationale for the transition that we had in our courses between SAQ to MCQs and some of the theory behind these assessment questions. I will then jump back in, go over the workflow we had of how we used and how we created a bespoke ChatGPT bot for us, what worked and what does the future perhaps hold for us, but more generally for the sector as well. And I always like starting my slides with a definition of what is generative AI, or what is AI rather. And I always like using John McCarthy's definition because, as we all know, he's the father of AI as we know it. And I quite like this particular quote from him from 2007 because he said it is the science and engineering of making intelligent machines, especially intelligent computer programs. It is related to the similar task of using computers to understand human intelligence, but AI does not have to confine itself to methods that are biologically observable. And I quite like this definition because at the moment we're talking a lot about software, like OpenAI, ChatGPT, OpenAI, Copilot, things like that. But as we move into this arena, there will be a lot more of generative AI that we will see in robotics as well. So let's not forget machines as a more general term. And before I jump into our practical example, I think I always find it useful to debunk some of these terminologies because sometimes we tend to use AI interchangeably with machine learning, with deep learning, with generative AI, and they're all very distinctive things. And I quite like these two graphics. This graphic shows the evolution of these different technologies over time. And this graphic on the right-hand side shows how each of them fits within each other. So the very beginning is artificial intelligence. And as John McCarthy said, is actually using machines to simulate human intelligence. That is a very broad term, it's the very beginning of the technology. And that encompasses everything else. So AI is the umbrella term. Next, we have machine learning, and I did a lot of machine learning during my PhD. And machine learning is basically using algorithms and training them to predict patterns. Machine learning is a very primitive form of generative AI. And we can see machine learning in credit scoring, for example. When we sign up, let's say, to a credit scoring agency, they take all of our different credit ratings, our spending, and they predict how our future will be in terms of our financial stability. Basically what mortgage advisors do, or a credit check. So it's very basic in terms of its capabilities. Then we go a little bit deeper, which is a subspecialty, let's say, of machine learning, which is deep learning. Here we start using neural networks, we start actually using more advanced algorithms, and it's not just prediction, is actually looking into the data a little bit more. So here, for example, we can have more sophisticated algorithms, like Alexa, for example, is not just based on simple predictive modeling. And a subset of deep learning is generative AI. And generative AI is the youngest child of this technology, and is basically training specific algorithms to produce output. And that is very important to say. It's not new output, it's not novel output, it's based on what we have trained the algorithms and the data set we have provided. In terms of where we are in our sector, we have moved into generative AI. In terms of other sectors, for example, healthcare, they're still at the deep learning phase. They haven't really moved into how incorporating generative AI. So I think from higher education, we can actually advance quite a lot and lend our expertise to other sectors, especially healthcare. So what has happened recently? What has happened in the past 2.5 years is that gap that existed between machines, the software, and humans has disappeared. So instead of having scientists who know how to do coding, we don't need that anymore. We can just base ourselves on simple prompt. And this is prompt engineering. So prompt engineering is the bridge between humans and generative AI platforms. And prompt engineering is these tailored prompts that we can feed into our platform to get the best output. And as Peter was saying, nowadays we can even record these prompts. They can be text, they can be visual, they can be audio. But to get the best out of an algorithm and a bot, we really need to understand how the model works, first of all, but also we need to understand on how and on what data that algorithm has been trained on. And it's this process, this iterative and interactive process. So we have the prompt from the human, the output from the machine, and then we review that prompt and we go back to the output. The interesting thing is the more familiar we become with prompts, the faster we get the output that we want. And that is a process, as Sue was saying actually at the end of her, in one of the questions, is training ourselves to get the best out of the platforms. And as Kenji mentioned, is that AI literacy. So the more we learn how to do this process, the better we'll become. So detailed, clear, and specific prompts gives us more precise and relevant outputs. I'll hand over to Michelle now to go over our assessment, and then I'll come back with our workflow. So Michelle.
Thank you, Ourania. So where we came at this was we jointly between the three of us, we have coordinated over the years our Year 3 Anatomy BSc course. Now the students for this course do all 120 credits with us in anatomy, and they're assessed with various coursework throughout the year, but at the end of the year traditionally they did 2 3-hour exam papers, which included some compulsory short answer questions as well as optional essays. Now the rationale behind this, I think everyone's quite clear on the use of essays in sort of junior honours years, and the compulsory short answer questions were to ensure that everybody was having to demonstrate a breadth of knowledge. And the short answer questions, gave the students the opportunity to, in theory, show their writing ability, their higher skills and knowledge, elicit a range of different responses, and getting them to really demonstrate their anatomical knowledge in a variety of topics. But over the years, we've started to become increasingly concerned that we were really only giving them 4 or 5 compulsory short answer questions for a whole semester long 60 credit course. We really weren't assessing the breadth. We were still touching a little bit on the depth, but we already had the essays that were touching on that depth. We were also mindful that the short answer questions were again favouring students who had better writing skills that the essays were already assessing, and the challenges of marking those, being consistent, coming up with an appropriate marking scheme that made it not so subjective, allowing us to be able to differentiate between our students. And we were starting to feel that the short answers that they were giving really weren't giving them an ability to demonstrate those advanced skills that we were looking for. They weren't constructing arguments. They were bluffing, rambling, often going off on tangents. And it left us feeling really questioning whether the effort that it was taking to write good short answer questions from staff to mark them, actually, were we really testing what we wanted to test in our students, which was the breadth of knowledge that they had? Ourania, next slide, please. So that led us to think, maybe it was a time for change in our assessment approach in year 3. Now, these thoughts came just around the same time that the University of Glasgow agreed to move these exams back on campus for our students. So our questioning whether these SAQs were the right pedagogical approach to assess the skills we were looking to assess in our students came at the same time that we were also mindful that the students were going to be writing exams for the first time in their university career, that we were going to be marking all of these exams with all of the factors that come with those handwritten exams, you know, the clarity of their presentation, being able to read their handwriting, etc. So at that point, we questioned whether short answer questions were really the most useful approach for our assessment, and whether there was another way we could go, keeping the essays still to get that depth, still to get the higher order skills, but were perhaps multiple choice questions a more appropriate use for us to be able to assess the breadth of their anatomical knowledge. And this really was assessing sort of a more factual recall level ILO within the course rather than the higher order skills that the essays were. So we wanted to approach this thinking about bringing in multiple choice questions, but doing it in a way that we continue to discourage the students from just relying on pure rote learning, still looking for them to apply their knowledge, still looking for them to test higher order skills, but doing it in a more appropriate way for our students in this new environment. But in doing so, it was February when this decision came, and the exams were, of course, in the April-May diet. So we had a really short turnaround for this. We were still trying to teach the course, support our students through this transition to on-campus assessment, but wanted to try to change it from short answer questions to multiple choice for this part of the exam. And we wanted to do it in a way that we could support the workload burden on staff, and try to produce multiple choice that still had the same difficulty level as the short answer questions would, but would not require them to write out their answers. Next slide, please, Ourania. So I'm sure everyone here is very aware of the benefits of multiple choice. You know, it really allowed us to go for the breadth. It allows much better breakdown and standardization of student performance. And once you have a bank of multiple choice questions, obviously there's a lot you can do with that bank. But the design had to be really carefully thought through. You know, MCQ questions can traditionally test more lower order thinking skills, like just pure factual recall. And so the writing of good questions can be difficult and can take some time, especially making sure that we didn't build on that reputation that MCQs are easy. We wanted to bring this in at junior honours appropriate level rather than at more junior levels where MCQs tend to be used. So that was where Ourania had the idea for trying to use AI, generative AI, to support us in this. So I'll hand that back to you now, Ourania, to talk about how we approached that.
Perfect. Thank you, Michelle. So, bear with me to move my slide. So what did we do in this particular case? So just as a bit of a contextual background, so my PhD was very much based on machine learning and data-driven approaches. So I was already familiar with more of the machine learning and data-driven analysis method. So stepping into the generative AI kind of felt naturally as a progression. So the first thing that we did is we assessed our needs, as Michelle very nicely explained, and then we developed a stepwise process. So our process involved 4 different stages. The first stage was the development of a secure and bespoke ChatGPT that was trained on our existing SAQ bank and lab manuals. And this was quite important. As you mentioned, and Peter as well earlier on, and as we are all aware, whatever we put in is what would get out. So that training data set was quite important. We used the SAQ bank since 2017, both the questions and the answers. And the beauty of that is that this SAQ bank has been created by several different colleagues with different writing styles. And that very much informed the development of the bot. We also used the lab manuals and some selected lectures as well. and that created our bot. So that was the very first step. The second step was to generate the MCQs, the same way we would do by pulling a paper together in terms of blueprinting and the rest, but asking the actual bot to generate the questions for us. Stage 3 was where the human, excuse me about the spelling mistake, the human experts came into the question, and they started verifying all the work for accuracy. And this again was very important because we don't just have AI on its own, we have very much a partnership using technology to our benefit. And finally, like in every step of the assessment process, we had all content undergoing internal and external scrutiny. So how were we successful? So how did we manage this? First of all, it was very much a collaborative partnership with experts from each field. So the content experts, and in our particular case, the anatomy subject specialist was one of the most important elements. First of all, to train our dataset and create the bot, but also for stage 3 to come into the equation and each person with their subject expertise to make sure that what we are asking our students for that higher level thinking, not just straight recall of MCQs, was appropriate. Then we had myself, and that can be any generative AI expert who's well versed in the platform that we're using. In our particular case, we use ChatGPT just because I'm familiar with the prompts and how to get the prompts working in this particular platform, but it doesn't have to be this particular software. And this is where you need to find the expert that is best well versed in the platform you're thinking of using. And finally, the QA experts, including our external examiner. So that was very much a partnership. And I think that's one of the key strong messages from this talk is the partnership between different experts coming together to create a very tangible example. So what we'll do for the next stage, we'll walk you through the different stages of how we develop the bot, and we'll show you examples of the MCQs, but then also we'll do a real live demo so we can actually use a question and see how we can utilize prompt engineering very much by a hands-on experience. So as we said, the first stage was creating the Glasgow anatomy assessment bot. And here we have actually the backbone of the ChatGPT. So this is not the interface that we will use to generate, to use prompts to generate the output, but is actually when we start creating the bot. So simple things like a description and a name, but also instructions. So when you start developing your own bot, it's very important to train it the way that is best suited to your needs. So the most important need for us at this stage was to be a private, secure bot because we wanted to maintain confidentiality and control over who has access to the data. So no one has access to this particular data because it's a private bot that only myself and my colleagues have access to it through a specific link. But this doesn't mean that the bot doesn't speak it doesn't mean that it doesn't have web browsing capabilities. It means that the data that we're putting into the bot is not shared widely. So that was one of the most important things, upholding high standards of privacy and security. And you can change the instructions and configure the bot the way you want it. For us, it was bespoke, as I said, in terms of feeding it and training it into, first of all, the questions that were important for us, but also in terms of the teaching material. In terms of capabilities, we also wanted to have web browsing so that it can still learn from the web. We also wanted to have image generation capabilities. And in case we also wanted our students, let's say, to use R, we also wanted to have a code interpreter as well. Now I'll pass you back to Michelle and she will go over stage 2 and 3.
Thanks, Ourania. So when we put prompts into the bot that Ourania had developed, initially, maybe just bring all the slides up, Ourania, that's fine. Initially, we put questions in, and we put this image in, and we asked it to come up with questions. So originally, the original short answer question was a short answer on the students saw this image. It's a histology image of an embryo, and they were asked to label the structures and explain how structure F develops and links to structure D. So the first part was more of a factual recall part, identify what you can see. And the second part to the short answer question was getting them to think more about the process involved, a bit of deeper level thinking. So when we initially used AI to develop an MCQ, it went very simple to start with. So structure G is a major blood vessel. Which one is it? So it kind of was giving away the answer that it is a blood vessel. Which one? The students had only really learned about a couple of major blood vessels at this stage, so it really narrowed down which one it was very likely to be. Next slide, please, Ourania. So when we were using this, it was really a case of getting the AI to prompt it, thinking about what it might come up with, but then reflecting and reviewing in our academic practice, is that the best question choice? And that's where it really required a human expert who knew about embryology to be able to review, to think, is that an appropriate question? And so then we were able to reflect on, actually, we don't want that, but instead, can we change major blood vessel just to structure? And then can we change the outputs of what it might be to giving different distractors that were actually things that could be found within that area, and could be realistic distractors for the students. So it then, and this is a very obvious simplistic MCQ that we're showing here, one that was really obvious of how we should change it. But what we learned through our experience of reviewing them was initially the prompts we were giving the bot wasn't, they weren't specific enough, they weren't detailed enough, they weren't requesting a higher enough level, as Peter showed and Sue showed in their earlier presentation. This idea around adding university into that image at the end really changed the image that you had. We started to realize that we really had to prompt the bot a lot more to give us the specifics of what we were looking for. So, using the correct scientific language, getting it to think more about, asking it to give distractors that were suitable for a university level student, really started to develop the type of questions that we were getting from it. And often the bot was really helpful to give us the initial stem for the question, and then we just overrid some of the distractors to being things we thought were more appropriate. Next slide, Ourania. So
that's 2 minutes left, sorry.
Perfect. That's so that was where it became really important to have that quality assurance, that internal scrutiny before it then went to our external examiner for review, because often the questions that it was creating, certainly initially, were not appropriate for our student level. Ourania, over to you for the last slides.
Thank you. So I'm gonna actually skip the live demo and just go to the hints and tips in the last couple of slides. So what did we learn through this process, and what are our hints and tips? First of all, to create a private ChatGPT, it requires a paid subscription. It's not something that you can do with a free version. It also requires a very good training data set. So we did have a data set since 2017, and that made a huge difference. As it has been said several times, what we put in is what we get out. But it did reduce the time for the first drafting of the questions, and we utilized the humans for the higher level thinking. So did it work? From our point of view, yes, it did. MCQs had comparable results to the pre-pandemic SAQs, so we're quite happy with that. It did speed up the process for us as well, especially when we were up against it in terms of time. It also allowed for good discrimination between the higher and lower ends of the cohort, which perhaps were not achieving as much with our SAQs in the past. And what does the future hold for us? So the positives. We learned that by using this particular bot, we can have an initial backbone of the assessment questions. And I say here, create very carefully, it frees up time to start focusing on higher level assessment tasks. So refinement of the assessment questions, as Michelle was saying, and the quality assurance processes. But it still takes time, even with this approach, to write good MCQs and generally to write good essay questions, exam questions. The other thing is that not everyone is well versed with generative AI and prompt engineering. So what we're suggesting here, and again, this is all for discussion, we'll be more than happy to take this forward in the Padlet, is raising awareness of the responsible use of generative AI and debunking it. But how do we do that? Well, perhaps providing upskilling on generative AI and bringing the different partnerships and the different experts, prompt engineering, and exam queue writing. So it's very much what Kenji was mentioning before, which is generative AI literacy. How do we achieve that in our sector? And we hope that we have set a practical example of how we have done it, and perhaps we have kind of tapped on these two solutions on how we can use generative AI in assessment with some hints and tips. We look forward to any questions you may have, and thank you for listening. Stop.